What's happening, folks? Let's continue on with this conversation on risk. One of the things you have to really understand is that risk is social in nature. Risk is it must be seen as being embedded in social relations. Um, One of the ways to think about this is that knowledge is influenced by relations of power and trust. You can't understand the concept of knowledge unless you understand how it is embedded in a power structure and whether we trust that power structure to provide us with the right knowledge. Power relations influence both knowledge that comes to your attention and knowledge that you seek out. And trust will influence what you make of that knowledge if you see a risk. This really leads us to understand that rational choice perspective misses the social nature of risk. So the old school rational choice perspective is really swinging and missing on this concept of the social nature of risk. And we need to understand that risk and uh, natural disaster is embedded in communal social relationships and how we respond to these natural disasters is imperative to whether community continues to exist as we move past the risk events. Um, uh, in order to understand this perspective, we have to understand the culture of risk. Um, this takes us into the realm of the perceptions of and responses to risk and how they're fundamentally shaped and embedded in the cultures that they exist in. People accept risks that reinforce social solidarity and of their institutions, and they tend to not accept risks that do not. And this also leads us to understand that risks are artifacts of cultural surroundings, and they reinforce our culture. They come from culture, and they reinforce that culture as we work through those risks in society. Um, Culture brings us back to this concept of choice. We need to be wary of the problem of functionalism, or seeing the functions of larger society as the only thing that controls the parts. Culture works two ways: something that shapes us and something that we in turn shape. Culture influences our choices and gives us choices. So in order to understand how society constructs risk, we have to understand that it is a combination of both structure and agency. Both of them are working together in an effort to create the cultural landscape that we find ourselves embedded in. The key, however, is how individuals conceptualize just how voluntary or involuntary a risk may be. We're not as concerned with how outsiders view it. One of the things that we also need to understand is that choice is central to knowledge. If you don't know something is a risk, it's harder to make a choice and say you had made a voluntary choice. So one of the most important ideas that I have learned in my sociological studies was written as a bumper sticker, and it was on the door of one of my favorite early sociologists, a guy named John Gallagher, and it said, "Is ignorance bliss or is ignorance oblivion?" And I personally think ignorance is oblivion, but ignorance as bliss speaks to this issue. if we don't know what the risk is, then it's really impossible to make a voluntary choice about how to prevent the risk, how to address the risk when it happens. There are, of course, knowledge gaps that emerge among experts and between experts and non-experts. The world is too complex for us to know everything. All the facts upon which we base our actions on it's just impossible to know all of the variables that went into a certain decision, an event, and we shouldn't waste our time trying to understand the whole. The readings talk about two types of knowledge gaps. There's vertical knowledge gaps and horizontal knowledge gaps. Vertical knowledge gaps are information that's not communicated across the levels of society's hierarchies. Knowledge does not pass from the top of society to the bottom. This, of course, could be a deliberate suppression of information. A good example of this is the evidence about health consequences of smoking and how the industries themselves tried to prevent the general population from understanding that health issues were real and they were problematic. Horizontal knowledge gaps. This is where knowledge exchanged within a level in the social hierarchy breaks down. Knowledge between scientists can break down, where some don't have the same information. This suppression of evidence by tobacco corporations meant that corporate scientists and university scientists did not share the same pool of knowledge. And if they did share the same pool of knowledge, they were not allowed to report on it. So understanding where the horizontal knowledge gaps exist and the vertical knowledge gaps exist is paramount for us to understand the risk society that we live in and how to continue to live in it as we move forward. Rational risk assessments must be seen as cultural practices. The language you use to discuss current day worries is very rationalistic. Risk equals kind of the images of science or studies that have been done or will be done. Rational knowledge is supposed to be everybody's knowledge, and that's only in theory. Even though the enterprise of science is open for anybody to engage upon it, some people aren't encouraged to play the game. And part of that is because they are a disempowered group in a system of knowledge production that is very much embedded in power relationships. This has led to a relatively new discipline within the field of sociology called the sociology of disasters. What the sociology of disasters is getting at is that life is indeed risky sometimes, and it has material worries and uncertainties. But what do these do to the social whole? Well, sometimes those worries and uncertainties become disastrous realities. Disasters not only affect individual people, but can also threaten the social fabric that links us to one another. And this is the true tragedy of a disaster, is how it destroys the social fabric. I want to draw us back to this idea of natural disasters. By labeling a disaster as natural, allows it to remain in morally innocent realms, or the realm of the natural conscience. But most natural disasters aren't natural disasters. They look like it on the surface, but when we dig a little bit deeper into them, we see that man's avarice has played a critical role in the failure of the structures we've put in place to manage nature. So a real good question is, was Hurricane Katrina a natural disaster? Um, in some respects, yes, but in other respects, no. The levees were in very poor condition, and um, the Go Canal, which had been built as a throughway for the Mississippi River um, to stay, or at least the port of the Mississippi River to stay close to New Orleans, allowed for saltwater to creep up into the Mississippi River, which then in turn created um, uh, disasters in the mangroves. And this, in turn, created the potential for flooding and catastrophe associated with flood surge in a hurricane. This leads us to a new, what we're now calling a new species of trouble, um, and that is the response to natural disasters. And this has created this emergence of a corrosive community, a place where community itself becomes soiled, ruined, and fractured as people flounder in deep malaise due to a natural disaster that happened in their area and then a failed response. This is central in the sense of betrayal that it creates in the residents that were the innocent victims of a natural disaster, and then the complicit victims in the response. Disasters that can be understood as the work of nature versus those that need to be understood as the work of humankind are important to distinguish between.